Mathematicians are known for being easygoing and tolerant of errors, but there are certain things that grind our gears, like these logos depicting impossible gear configurations, and others that really get our goat, like sticking with your first choice on the Monty Hall game. But what really winds us up is this wound up curve, the golden spiral. Why? Because in many places, from pseudoscientific websites to school classrooms, we see claims that the golden spiral and golden ratio are found everywhere in nature. These ideas are perpetuated in Darren Aronofsky's film debut, Pi. Often claimed are connections to the Fibonacci sequence, that the golden ratio is the most irrational number, that we subconsciously imbue it in works of art, and that it appears in nature. Some of these things are true. Which ones? And why? And is Pi guilty of mathematical misconduct? Originally, I wrote this video as an episode of Mathematical Accuracy in Films, but most of the video will be spent exploring the golden ratio. A short discussion of some numerology found in Pi will follow, as well as my verdict on where I think the film falls on our accuracy versus quality graph. Don't worry if you haven't seen the film, this video is spoiler free. To briefly set the scene, Pi follows mathematician Max, and which of the usual stereotypes were chosen for this character? Yes, he is paranoid, a mental calculator, socially awkward, and obsessive.
73 divided by 22.
3.318181818.
For the record, I don't hate this. There's a level of intensity and realism in Sean Gallette's performance that we seldom see in mainstream films. An unfortunate early goof takes place during the title sequence, which is otherwise great, channeling intensity reminiscent of those title sequences of Alfred Hitchcock or David Fincher. But there's something kind of funny about getting the decimal expansion for the number pi, the film's namesake, incorrect. Pausing here, we see that everything after this point is just wrong. I don't know the reason for this. Surely even back in 1998, the first several thousand digits of pi were easily Googleable. Or, well, this is the 90s, so ask Jeevesable. Also pictured are a few mathematical objects like a Möbius band and this graph of what looks like the poles of the Riemann zeta function. Maybe this is childish of me, but I find it kind of cheesy how this Möbius band is waved in our face like, ooh, maths, scary. Early on, we have a scene where Max, after struggling on a problem, has an epiphany about spirals, and somehow uses that in his work. Max gives a small lecture to the audience about the golden ratio and the golden spiral, which appear everywhere in nature. Apparently. But do they? Here we go. The golden ratio is a number, and it comes from the following relationship. Start with a line segment and pick a point on it, splitting it into lengths A and B. Now there will be a number I can multiply B by to get to A, and there will also be a number I can multiply A by to get to the total length A plus B. For example, if the point is 3/4 along, then B times 3 gives A, and A times 4/3 gives A plus B. By varying this point, we vary these ratios. But is there a magic point where these ratios are equal? Yes, it's about here, and we can derive exactly where it is. Make them both the subject and equate them, so our special ratio R is such that R equals A over B and A plus B over A. Split that into 1 plus B over A, which is 1 plus the reciprocal of R, thus R equals 1 plus 1 over R. Multiply through by R to create a quadratic equation and solve using your preferred method. I'm going to complete the square here. We obtain root 5 plus 1 over 2, which is about 1.618. This number is called the golden ratio, and it describes the magic point on a line segment where small to big is the same as big to total. Like many special numbers, we assign it a letter, in this case, phi, although in the film,
The result approaches theta.
theta?
Theta, the Greek symbol for golden ratio, golden spiral.
I've never heard of theta being used as the notation for this number, and I couldn't find any record of it. I can only imagine the writers confused these Greek letters. Phi does pop up in mathematics. We see it in the regular pentagon, and it's a fun exercise to try to prove this. But the golden ratio appears in the film because the characters discuss the Fibonacci sequence. What does that have to do with the golden ratio? Well, I'll let Max explain.
like the Fibonacci sequence. An Italian mathematician in the 13th century. If you divide 144 into 233, the result approaches theta.
This is completely true and a beautiful relationship. What we're essentially saying is that if we pick two successive Fibonacci terms, say 89 and 144, and make those our A and B, then this is approximately in golden ratio. The higher up the sequence you go, the more accurate the approximation becomes. We see that the nth term, Fn, divided by the previous term, approaches phi as n approaches infinity. So why is this? Why should this have anything to do with the golden ratio? Well, intuitively, if A and B are in golden ratio, then the sequence A plus B does have a common ratio, and it does align with the rule for generating Fibonacci terms. In fact, if we use the Fibonacci rule to generate the next term, then we can verify that multiplying the previous term by phi will give us this next term. So whenever A and B are in golden ratio, there seems to be a bit of Fibonacci-ness to it. But how do we prove it? Well, we want to evaluate the limit as n tends to infinity of Fn over Fn minus 1. Call it x. Well, now note that Fn is the sum of the two previous terms, Fn minus 1 plus Fn minus 2. And now let me break up this fraction. So this is just 1 plus the limit as n tends to infinity of Fn minus 2 over Fn minus 1. Now I'm going to do a cheeky change of variables here. So note that the limit as n tends to infinity of Fn minus 2 over Fn minus 1 is the same as the limit as n tends to infinity of Fn minus 1 over Fn. Just because we start one term behind doesn't change the fact that the limit will be the same as n grows to infinity. And why did I do that? Well, now note that this is the reciprocal of this. So we use the well-known property that the reciprocal of the limits is the same as the limit of the reciprocals if the limit exists, which, trust me, it does. So when all is said and done, we have that x is equal to 1 plus 1 over x. This can be rearranged into the same quadratic equation we had earlier, and we know phi is the solution. Before we move on, one of my favourite phi facts is that 1 mile is about 1.61 kilometers. So that means that a mile and a kilometer are approximately in golden ratio. Hence, successive Fibonacci terms approximate conversions. 8 miles will be about 13 kilometers. Handy for metric M&M fans. And why are they in approximate golden ratio? It's a coincidence, which leads me to my next point. Plenty of hacks will try to tell you that the golden ratio is fundamental to beauty. Look at how the proportions of the human face and the bones in our fingers align to the golden ratio, or how we subconsciously imbue it in great works of art like the Parthenon or the Mona Lisa. Did you know that the two main supercontinents, the Americas and Afro-Eurasia, align to the golden ratio? With so many examples, can it really be a coincidence? Yes, and there are two subtle things going on here which exaggerate the effect. The first is that there is only one golden ratio. Consider this, in those examples I showed you, this isn't even the golden ratio. It's close, but close to the golden ratio is not the golden ratio. We shouldn't be surprised that drawing three lines like this can sometimes sync up with these features, and sometimes it's just plainly false. This is a genuine x-ray of my own hand from the 8th time I suffered a bone fracture. You can see the fracture in my metacarpal there. We can see that it's not even close to the golden ratio. The second thing is that we get to choose where to draw the lines. If you superimpose the golden ratio on anything and scale it, you will be able to find points that match up with various features, especially if you combine it with the first point where approximate is good enough. I made up that point about the continents because I downloaded any old world map and found where lines matched up. This is what's going on in the human face. You can scale up any ratio and cherry pick features that match, or here in pi when Max matches the ratio to Da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, or here in the Parthenon. Why this specific side of this specific column? Because it happens to work. These ideas also apply to the golden spiral, which Max attributes to Pythagoras, but nobody really knows who studied it first. There are many types of spiral, like an Archimedean spiral, Euler spiral, spiral from the Book of Saw, but of interest to us is a logarithmic spiral. These are ones where the distance from the origin are in geometric progression. For example, here is one where the distance doubles every turn. You can pick any ray from the origin, and its distance will have doubled by the next time the spiral crosses it. So in this one, we're multiplying by 2 each time, but we could be multiplying by anything like 3, 1.5, whatever. In the specific case where we multiply by the golden ratio each quarter turn, we have what we call the golden spiral. Again, hacks will tell you that the golden spiral appears everywhere in nature, but it isn't true. Hurricanes, the Milky Way, Nautilus shells, they are all logarithmic spirals, but seldom this one specific spiral. Now, why do we get so uptight about this? Well, one reason is because mathematicians simply care about the truth, so falsehoods rattle us. But for me, the golden ratio and golden spiral are beautiful objects with plenty of amazing qualities which can be overshadowed by the fake ones. Because phi and Fibonacci numbers do appear in nature sometimes. If you count sunflower seeds, which form these spiral patterns, it's always 2 successive Fibonacci numbers. Pine cones and pineapples are similar. Hell, we should be calling them fine cones and pineapples. So why is that? Well, imagine that you are a beautiful sunflower. Oh, thank you. No, not you, them. Just keep filming. Now, as a sunflower, in your DNA, there will be some kind of algorithm for distributing seeds in the center of the flower. Efficient packings of seeds are naturally selected for. So, what does an efficient packing look like? Well, let's say you place a seed every quarter turn, but then you'll kind of bump into yourself and the packing will be rubbish. Okay, another fraction, so maybe every 3/5 of a turn? Well, you can see that you'll eventually crash into a previous one. Now, this kind of inefficiency will actually happen for any rational number, so maybe the gap between placements should be irrational. But which irrational number? Well, some irrational numbers can be approximated better than others. Pi, for example, is pretty close to 22 on 7, so pi won't be that much more efficient than that. Similarly for e, which is pretty close to 19 on 7. So which irrational number isn't easily approximated by rationals? Well, to see which, let's see where these rational approximations come from. As you might know, 333 over 106 is a better approximation for pi, and even better is 355 on 113. Did mathematicians just get bored and try dividing numbers over and over until they found ones that are close to pi? No. It turns out every irrational number can be expressed as something called a simple continued fraction. This is an infinitely descending fraction whose limit is equal to the irrational in question. For example, this is the simple continued fraction for e. By the way, I'm not the first YouTuber to go through this process. Many years ago, Ben Sparks made a great video with Numberphile, which has some amazing animations to show the various packings of the sunflower seeds, if you want to go and check that out. To get a feel for simple continued fractions, let's build the one for pi. We'll start with the biggest integer less than pi, which is 3, and now we need to deal with the fractional part. We want to add a fraction with numerator 1 that is close to this fractional part. If 1 equals n equals this, then we can rearrange for n equals 7.062, etc. To obtain an integer approximation, we just floor it to 7. But we could carry on, so instead write this as 7 plus its fractional part, and then again, rearranging for that fractional part, we obtain 15.9965, which we floor to 15, and we can carry on in this manner for as long as we like. The process will never end because pi is irrational. At every step of this process, we get a pretty good rational approximation, and some rational approximations are better than others. 355 on 113 is known for being a very good approximation, because it takes 6 digits to define, but yields 7 correct digits of pi, a rare property. The reason that approximation is so good is because the next approximation has a very big denominator. The bigger the denominator, the smaller the adjustment required for the next approximation. It's the fraction's way of saying, hey, you're already pretty close, you just need a very small tweak. Generally then, large entries in the simple continued fraction signal very efficient approximations. On the flip side, small entries in the simple continued fraction yield very bad approximations. Surely then, the number with the worst approximations will be the number whose continued fraction has only the smallest numbers, i.e. all ones. And what number is this? Well, whatever number this is, call it x, we see it replicated here. So x equals 1 plus 1 over x, Rearrange that into the same quadratic we saw earlier, of which phi is a solution. That's right, phi is the irrational number with the least efficient rational approximations. Bringing this back to sunflower seeds, remember we wanted to place them an irrational amount that isn't close to a rational number. And because phi is the most difficult number to approximate, it gives the most efficient packings. And it's why people often refer to phi as the most irrational number. But it goes deeper. This area of study is called Diophantine approximation, concerned with finding rational approximations of irrational numbers. A good approximation is such that the distance between the rational and irrational is very small. And how do we generalize that idea of a small distance? Well, what we really want is for this to be less than something small. So I'm going to say less than epsilon. And actually, we want to generate an infinite string of rational approximations, much like these approximations for pi. So the further up the string you go, the closer and closer and closer you get to the irrational in question. If it were only a finite string, you'd be basically capping how good your approximation could ever be. So we want an infinite string. And this epsilon here will actually depend on this rational. The idea being that the further up the infinite chain of P and Q we go, the tighter this bound, the smaller this epsilon becomes, and therefore makes the bound tighter, therefore these numbers are getting closer and closer and closer together. But remember, we don't want to make the bound so tight as to only yield a finite string of approximations, because then that caps how good the approximations can be. So, what is a good example of this epsilon of P and Q? Well, German mathematician Adolf Hurwitz proved there are infinitely many rationals P over Q which satisfy this bound, 1 over root 5 times Q squared. This holds for every possible irrational number. What happens when we try to make this bound just a little bit tighter? Instead of root 5, what if we chose a distant constant, maybe one that was slightly bigger, thereby lowering the bound just a little bit? Well, here's the mind-blowing fact. I claim if we replace root 5 with any constant larger than root 5, even just a tiny bit bigger, then there now exists an irrational which is so hard to approximate that only a finite string of approximations satisfies the bound. Which irrational do you think that is? Of course, it's phi. I think this is extraordinary, so let me prove it for you. Suppose for contradiction that infinitely many P and Q exist which satisfy this. Now, a subtle consequence of this is that there will be infinitely many Qs, which might sound like your local supermarket, but what I really mean is, if there were only finite Qs, then for each of these Qs, there will be a best P which approximates phi. But we're saying that these fractions get closer and closer to phi forever, and so we need to keep increasing the denominator as well to account for that. Okay, now let me rephrase this distance here. What this is saying is that phi is equal to P over Q plus a small error, and I'll call that error delta times 1 over Q squared. Now, because the distance between phi and P over Q is less than this distance here, it must be the case that delta is less than 1 over A, and therefore less than 1 over root 5. And now a long bit of algebra, just rearranging things to get something that we can use. Feel free to pause and go through each step in more detail, but the punchline is this equality here. And consider this right-hand expression. How big is it? Well, when we consider its size, it must be less than or equal to this by the triangle inequality. This first term here is strictly less than 1 because of our assumption about delta and A up here. And now this second term has a denominator of Q squared, but we've said that there are infinitely many Qs, so we can take Q to be arbitrarily large, thereby making this as small as we like. We can make it so small that even after we add it to this whole right-hand side is still less than 1. So if this has size less than 1 for sufficiently large Q, so does the left-hand side, and we need another bit of algebra to explore the consequences of this. Because what is this left-hand side? Let's simplify it. So we obtain this, but P and Q are integers, so this whole thing is an integer, which has size less than 1 for sufficiently large Q. So, for sufficiently large Q, this must be 0, that's the only integer less than 1. Again, a bit of algebra to see the consequences. The trick here is to times by -4, then add 5q squared to both sides. That allows us to factorize the left into a square, which we can then square root, and then we can rearrange this into p over q is equal to 1 plus or minus root 5 divided by 2. Again, pause if you want to go through each step in detail. I'm not going to dwell on it here, but it is a good exercise. But the point is that this is a contradiction. P over q, a rational number, cannot be equal to 1 plus or minus root 5 over 2, an irrational number. To me, this cements the notion that phi is the most irrational number, since Hurwitz's inequality holds for all possible rationals, but as soon as you try to improve it, phi breaks it. So that's the most irrational property of phi, and it's for this reason we see phi in other natural structures as well. But the extent to which we find it is largely exaggerated, and I'm sorry to say that pi does seem to prop up this debunked pseudo-mathematical nonsense. Is this a problem? Well, over the course of the film, Max has several breaks from reality, and it's unclear how real some of his experiences are. Thus, the film might perpetuate some of these myths, but the point is that Max believes them. His mentor even warns Max against pursuing such ideas in my favourite line of the film that longtime viewers might recognise.
As soon as you discard scientific rigor, you're no longer a mathematician. You're a numerologist.
And speaking of numerology, this is where we find much of the film's other mathematical content. Now, I hesitate to call this mathematics, as numerology, as Sol points out, is not the same thing. What's the difference? Mathematics, troublesome to define in and of itself, uses proof and rigor to discover and verify relationships between numbers, among other things. Numerology ascribes additional meaning or properties to numbers. A mathematician can discuss the number 4, for example. It's an integer, it's even, it's the first non-unit composite number, it's a square, and so on. All these properties have rigorous definitions that can be proven to apply to 4. A Pythagorean numerologist, for example, will tell you that 4 is female, represents justice, and if your life number is 4, then you are apparently practical and hardworking and reliable. By analogy, astronomers investigate the stars using science, while astrologers ascribe additional, unfalsifiable meanings to constellations and planetary bodies. Numerology works the same way as all pseudoscience. Take modern Pythagorean numerology. Use this chart to find your name number. So for me, that's 6. I'm caring, nurturing, and responsible with a strong sense of family and community. No, I'm a hermit with very little community spirit and a disdain for responsibility. Now, some could point out, but Alex, you're a teacher, you care about your students and it's a nurturing role. And that is all true, but that's the problem, you cannot falsify this. Whoever you are, you can twist this to fit your personality and circumstances. And anyway, my full name is Alexander, which gives 3. Creative, expressive, and sociable. And anyone who knows me personally has just erupted in laughter. And you might say, but Alexander, you make videos and that's creative. And there you go again, fixating on the points that fit and ignoring the expressive and sociable parts. Where this relates to pi is gematria, the practice of ascribing numbers to letters and examining relationships. Hebrew gematria is practiced in some Jewish communities, particularly those which practice Kabbalah. And in the film, we see an example of one way in which it can be applied.
Take the Hebrew word for father. Av equals 3. Hebrew word for mother, aim, 41. Sum of 3 and 41, 44. Hebrew word for child, 44.
I can't judge this for its mathematical accuracy, because this isn't mathematics. As a depiction of gematria, it's important to note that there are many kinds and interpretations. Some believe that the numbers just correspond to broad themes, and not these specific details. Some just use the numbers as a memory aid for certain passages, while others believe that patterns can be found in scripture which can uncover hidden messages. I don't ascribe to this latter belief. To me, it's a little bit like the infamous Bible code. The methodology used there can be used to find hidden messages in any book, most notably Moby Dick in this famous breakdown. A later mistake in the film is that they say that this is the word for the tree of knowledge.
Now the value of tree of knowledge, Eitz HaChaim.
But it's actually the tree of life. But to me the major flaw is that there will be plenty of words with 44 as their sum. So it's not outrageous to expect one of them to symbolize the intuitive sum of a mother and father. We find child, which fits, and dismissed the others, in much the same way that we picked out creative and dismissed expressive and sociable for me earlier. It's like Sol says in his best speech in the film.
When your mind becomes obsessed with anything, you will filter everything else out and find that thing everywhere.
As for the other bits of mathematics in the film, Max's computer is called Euclid, and he was a famous mathematician. An odd choice for a computer, but hey, you do you, Max. Sol incorrectly states that density is weight over volume, when really it's mass over volume.
It's a way to determine density, weight over volume.
And in a cracked mirror, we see what looks like a bifurcation diagram, but maybe I'm just reading too much into it. And in Sol's backstory, he was searching for patterns in pi. This is interesting. Pi is an irrational number, which means its expansion is necessarily infinite and non-repeating. But that doesn't mean patterns couldn't be discovered. Some irrational numbers are constructed with a pattern, like the Champernowne constant, 0.12345, etc. And some, like E, have patterns in some of their properties, like in their simple continued fraction, which looks like this and has a clear pattern while pi's doesn't. Though if we allow for generalized continued fractions, where the numerators don't have to be 1, we do see a pattern. As for whether patterns exist in the decimal expansion itself, I guess there might be some, though I'm not sure who would care enough to dedicate 40 years of study to such an endeavour. So that's it for the mathematics in the film. Let me quickly examine the film as a whole before we rank it on our 2-axis scale. I think all filmmakers would envy what Aronofsky managed to achieve in his debut on such a small budget. The arresting, high-contrast black and white draws us into Max's obsessive world of rigour, hard edges and rigid, well, black and white thinking. And the use of 16mm film stock adds a dense grain, creating this great surreal atmosphere. It's such a striking style that I can't help but get drawn in. Clint Mansell's soundtrack is awesome, and I love the oppressive sound design, especially during these nightmarish scenes depicting Max's recurring cluster headaches. We also see some techniques which would become tropes of Aronofsky's style later in his career, most notably the use of body mounts to capture these walking scenes, and the rapid-fire editing for recurring actions like Max unlocking his door in this rhythm, or as he takes his medication. Aronofsky would later expand on these in his next masterpiece, Requiem for a Dream. They look cool, but also efficiently progress the story. We see this recurring montage and know instantly that Max is a paranoid shut-in. The repetitive pill-taking montage shows us in a split second that Max is taking more and more pills as the story progresses. The film is actually full of these visual details, telling us wordlessly that Max is having an epiphany while gazing at spirals, and he takes the time to straighten his hair before knocking on his neighbour's door, despite how he always rejects her romantic advances. Is he actually interested in her? Or is he just levering her interest because he's about to ask her for a favour? Where the narrative suffers is in some of its expository scenes, where the story stops dead to explain mathematical ideas. Max narrates the origin of the golden ratio. He gives a mini lecture on how spirals are seen everywhere, and Sol tells the story of Archimedes. It's a bit stop-start. It views like a film written by someone who saw a few really interesting mathematical ideas and wanted to share them, that they are proud that they did their homework. But I think they could have been cut or trimmed to tighten up the narrative. Now, as an edgy, nerdy teenager, I adored this film. Despite now realizing that many of the connections made by the film are pseudoscientific, and that from a storytelling perspective, halting the plot to talk about maths is a bit questionable, I just thought it was amazing to see a film that took delight in sharing mathematical ideas and seeing it all around us. I'd listen to Max lecture us about the golden ratio and think, wow, it would be awesome to just know all of that stuff. I wanted to be like that, to know lots of mathematics and work on problems. It might have even played a small role in motivating me to study mathematics at a higher level. Ow. Clearly got too excited there, so even if some of it is bunk, I'll always look fondly on this film. As for a verdict, opinions of teenage Alex aside, I think this is a great film. Nothing else looks, feels, or sounds quite like it. It's a sharp 80 minutes with some efficient storytelling, with some sluggish lectures interspersed. I like the ambiguous meaning and variety in its ideas, but I can't say I ever feel that emotionally invested in Max or the story. So all in all, somewhere around here. Its accuracy is where I'm quite conflicted. The only hard mathematics discussed are the Fibonacci sequence's relationship to phi and a bit about the golden spiral, and that's actually on point. Everything else about the golden ratio and golden spiral and all that numerology stuff is, mathematically speaking, bunk. Pi appears to perpetuate these pseudoscientific notions, but I think that's only a surface reading of the film. Max comes to believe in these ideas, but he does go mad over the course of the story. So I don't think the film endorses these ideas, as they are communicated by characters whose judgment is unreliable. Still, I think some non-mathematician viewers might come away from this film believing some rubbish. So, I don't know, somewhere around the middle? Let's go for that. Like I always say, don't take the rankings too seriously, it's just a bit of fun. Thank you so much for watching. Still experimenting with this maths series, so thanks for tuning in to this one. Tuning in. How old am I? A massive thank you to my patrons, without whom I simply could not continue making videos, so thank you so much. And if you want to support me, you'll get your name in the credits along with all of these lovely people. You'll get access to my dedicated Discord server where we can hang out and nerd out about maths. You'll get access to bloopers, extended cuts of select videos, and much more. Or maybe you just want to support me, see the link below if so. This has been another proof under another roof, and I bid you goodbye.